So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. I'm your host, President Amedeo Maddaluno, and tonight we're talking about China. Obviously, in our own way, it won't be super detailed. We make these videos as introductions, a bit of history, a bit of geopolitics, and a bit of current events. These videos are lighter compared to the usual content on the channel, where we go into the details of geolocations, satellite images, and specific situations. These videos are made as a starting point for further exploration. If someone doesn't know anything about China or Turkey, they can watch that. Otherwise, they can check out the 2.5 hours we did with Professor Grassi if they want to see things about Turkey in more detail. As you can see from the title, which you wanted, Introverted Giant. And in fact, if we look at both the situation in Ukraine and the situation in Iran, it's not like China has been particularly vocal or has taken any risks, saying, we'll send them stuff, kind of like the Russians did with Venezuela, we'll send them stuff, and then they risk losing face. They've played very passively compared to what one would expect, looking at things from a Western perspective, from a country with that power and those capabilities.
Yes, but then, dear Mirko, yes, it's always worth including an introduction. These are introductory episodes where we frame certain topics. Usually there are always comments from those who get upset. And they say, but you didn't talk about this, but you didn't talk about that. We don't claim to fit all human knowledge into a 2-hour YouTube live stream. What we do claim, though, is to give you some keys to understanding, some tools for deeper exploration, some inspiration, and ideas for further study. The starting point for us, in fact, is China. An introverted giant, because the argument tonight is that a country of continental scale can be deeply inward-looking. We have looked at individual Middle Eastern countries, we have looked at the Maghreb, we have looked at the Balkans, we have looked at Turkey, we have covered some geographical variations into China, India. With this series of our country profiles, we move on to the three great powers, starting with China, that is, great powers of continental scale. We see China as less outward-looking and extroverted on the international stage. It is a relatively quiet country, whether we look at the climate. They tend to stop. America, considering the South and the Gulf crisis in our Western eyes, is disproportionately silent compared to its size. How come such a big, important country, the world's largest economy by some indicators, doesn't make any noise? To put it simply, how come they don't act like the Americans or the Russians, meaning they don't bomb a random country, they haven't bombed anyone yet? We'll see that, in fact, they've had their share of little wars, and let's hope they don't get the idea to start anymore, but we'll try to understand why there's all this silence. Here you see, this is how Westerners think of China, right? There's great tension, great fear about China's remarkable ability to penetrate the African market. Here we have a map from ISP from a few years ago. Well, I foolishly cut off the dates it refers to. This is how Africa was basically about 30 years ago, between 20 and 30 years ago, with only Sudan, which at the time was still united between Sudan and South Sudan. It traded, and China was its main trading partner, that's it. Today, almost all African countries have China as their main trading partner.
I wanted to ask you something about this. The Soviet Union also accelerated its own downfall because it had tied itself to so many deficit-ridden countries in Africa just to have more votes and more relevance, right? China has taken over in this sense with soft power, but it does it differently. That is, while the Russians were basically subsidizing them, and so these countries had become dead weight, especially when there was the period when the value of food production changed. China, on the other hand, tries to move forward. They bring their workers and extract directly, so let's say they benefit directly from that relationship. It's not like they just hand out direct subsidies for nothing, that's it.
Absolutely, yes. The Chinese approach is a commercial one. It's an approach of economic penetration. And mind you, we'll come back to this. It's not like the Soviet approach, which was also about ideological penetration. We'll come back to this, but make a note of it and keep it in mind. The Chinese approach to penetration is a commercial and economic one, which is then followed by political influence. The approach of the European colonial powers, which is very unpopular with African public opinion, is a military one first. I conquer you, I even exterminate you, and then comes economic subjugation. The American and Soviet approach during the Cold War was one of penetration that was as much economic, political, and military as it was ideological, especially communism or anti-communism. Colonialism, anti-colonialism, colonialism, American hegemony. Do you see what essentially remains of the French presence? A strong presence in Gabon, in Tunisia, a good South African presence in the southern part of the continent, and under other, what do we find? In Somalia, it's basically Turkish influence. Then China. In the countries where China has made inroads, now the main power, the first European commercial partner, is no longer France. But believe it or not, it's our Italy. Zoom in more on the other map, the one further to the left. There, as we can see, even among Europeans, China, the one with all the regions, yes, this one here. Let's see how in the debate, in the dialogue, in the dialectic between China and its neighbors. Thank you very much, Antonio. The globe you brought is really great. Thank you so much. You can see the provinces and governorates into which the People's Republic of China is divided, as well as the regions and autonomous regions, especially those historically inhabited by ethnic minorities, such as in the south, Yunnan, Tibet, Xinjiang, or eastern Turkestan, which is inhabited by a significant Turkic-speaking and Muslim minority, and of course, Inner Mongolia. Another region, Ningxia, is inhabited by the Hui, who are Han Chinese but of the Muslim religion. Obviously, autonomy. Just like in Russia, there are autonomous oblasts. Yes, well, autonomous, my friend, twice over, but in reality, there is no autonomy at all. Let's look at the border regions disputed with India, with which China has fought, if I remember correctly, 2 or 3 border wars, which basically ended in a draw. And some analysts say no, the Chinese won, because others say no, the Indians held their ground because it's basically a draw.
That had an impact in which the politician was dormant, because with the Gandhi family's policies, India was not particularly armed. Instead, China's treacherous intervention, even in their feud with Pakistan and so on, made them change their mind. That's when the militarization of India began. Until when was it? 56, if I remember correctly. Until that moment, India didn't really have an army, as a country of that size should have.
Absolutely agreed. Yes, that's how the story went. Then we have the green dots at the bottom. So that little island, that point at the far south, is a disputed area with Vietnam. And then we have Taiwan. We have now been made aware, even by the mainstream press. Taiwan, Republic of China, what remains of nationalist China, which claims control, obviously, over all of mainland China. And I must say also over some provinces today controlled by Russia, some territories controlled by Russia, over which the People's Republic of China, on the other hand, does not make official claims. Whatever people may say, beyond the nationalistic outbursts and the internal nationalist debate. In gray, the Diaoyu Islands disputed with Japan. They are Japanese territory, Ayu Senkaku in Japanese, but China claims them. So the Western lens for looking at China is that of its disputes with its neighbors, and the great fear that these could lead to open conflicts, as has already happened. Why with Vietnam? China in 77 78, if I remember correctly, fought a border war, the last war fought by China, and lost it. There instead, there's no doubt the Chinese lost and were pushed back with losses. They wanted to impose their will on Vietnam.
Was it about some little islands between Vietnam and China?
No, it wasn't that. Those were clashes in the 1990s.
Even before that, there was the actual border war.
Yes, it was a border war caused more by political reasons than territorial ones. The Chinese wanted to punish Vietnam, to teach Vietnam a lesson for the Vietnamese campaign against the Cambodian Khmer Rouge, who were pro-Chinese. So if we look at the last wars that China has fought from 49 to today since the establishment of the People's Republic of China, we have the Korean War, which ended in a draw. The wars with India, 2 or 3, I don't remember exactly, also ended in a draw, and the war with Vietnam. Lost, so several draws and 1 defeat, and we have the something close to victory in the conflicts fought at sea starting from the 1990s wars, clashes, skirmishes up to this point. So we see how, moving forward, China gradually gains more confidence in its military capabilities, especially towards its neighbors. So this is the Great Western Fear,
which is China. I would also add the Sino-Japanese Wars in the sense that most of the fighting was done by the official army, that of Kenai Shek, that is Chiang Kai-shek. The communists did very little, and then they basically clashed with the nationalists when they were already worn out, because they had endured almost 10 years of Japanese occupation. But they claimed it as if they were the ones who actually defeated the Japanese. All the wear and tear was borne by the nationalist army, and the final blow was dealt by the Russians when they attacked toward the end of 1945.
So 45.
Right in mid-1945 in Manchuria.
So Manchukuo actually, which at the time was, so they sold the story that they had taken back all the territory, but in reality, the Japanese army was worn out and the final blow was basically dealt by the Russians.
Exactly. Now, I'm asking you for the next slide. We forget that China is also this thing here, its internal geopolitical map. China is a country of continental dimensions. So, like all great countries, we can think of it in concentric rings. The historical core of Chinese civilization, which is not a maritime civilization, but a hydraulic one, that is one of the great civilizations born on rivers, like the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, is between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, which you can see highlighted here. The fertile lands, rice cultivation in southern China, wheat in northern China, a civilization that is therefore essentially hydraulic and authoritarian. I don't need to repeat it, we've already talked about it, the Wittfogel theory on the oriental despotism of hydraulic civilizations. This is the core of China. The great Chinese imperial dynasties, which have their roots in millennia before Christ, the Chinese civilization as a whole is about 4,000 years old, obviously, in its entirety. Around 1,800 BC, if I remember correctly, with the first evidence of writing and a central state. There you go. Then we have the Fujian and Guangdong provinces, which you see below, maritime China, the Chinese civilization expanding toward the sea. With the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. He was the one who started the construction of the Great Wall, built the Terracotta Army, and made some of the tribal kingdoms in the south of the country pay tribute. Then came the next dynasty, the Han Dynasty, which established diplomatic relations with the Roman Empire. Its name, Han, still gives its name to the most important Chinese ethnic group, the Han, the Chinese people. And then the following dynasties, which moved closer and closer to the sea, the Tang Dynasty, the period of greatest splendor for the Chinese Empire, which even had a fleet and tried to fight in Korea, the Song Dynasty, which was pushed further and further south by the Turkic and later Mongol peoples from the north of the country. And then came the Yuan Dynasty, the actual Mongol dynasty. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who began to give China by the 1300s the borders that we are starting to recognize today. And then there are the red areas to the north, Manchuria, Tungusic peoples, who would give rise to the last dynasty. If you've seen the movie The Last Emperor, which is extraordinary, well, that's it. A dynasty of Tungusic origin, the Manchu, Inner Mongolia, from which Turco-Mongol peoples would come, the Hans, then the Turkic peoples and the Mongol dynasties. So peoples of Altic stock, not of Sinitic stock. They will strongly contribute to bringing Buddhism to China, for example, and thus foreign ideals. Through these peoples, Islam will also arrive in China. They will serve as a bridge to the Silk Road. That's basically it. Then, to the west, what we call Eastern Turkestan or Xinjiang or whatever you want to call it, by its Chinese name, Turkish name, and so on. Uyghuristan, land of ancient dynasties, always Turkic-speaking, land where Manichaeism, Islam, and Nestorian Christianity were introduced, and a land of passage for Buddhism, the bridge to India and then below Tibet. So, non-Han lands, which have been at various times in history tributaries of different Chinese dynasties, and therefore China claims them as its own. But they are not culturally Han, they are not culturally Chinese. So China, in its historical core, is a land-based culture. It's the culture of the two rivers. It's the hydraulic agricultural culture of rice and wheat.
A bit like throughout world history, right? The Mesopotamian culture, civilizations are always born around rivers. I wanted to ask you today, how homogeneous is China from the point of view of ethnic groups? Is there still this differentiation, or apart from the more remote areas, are they more or less homogeneous? Because it's an important factor, homogeneity, if someone wants to get into a clash between major countries.
They have dozens and dozens of ethnic minorities. A population of 1.4 billion, not just 1.5 billion, even if that's what they say, we'll get to that. A population of 1.4 billion people has dozens and dozens of different ethnic groups officially recognized. The massive core of the Chinese population is made up of the Han Chinese, that is, people of Chinese culture who speak Sinitic languages, who have the cultural heritage of Confucianism, and especially also Buddhism, Taoism, their traditional religions, their Chinese paganism. That these populations then absorb ethnic minorities, well, that's a matter of history. They, of course, even by looking at facial features, can distinguish a Chinese person from the north from one from the south, or from someone more from the inland areas. Obviously, the accents. The official Chinese is Mandarin Chinese, the Chinese of Beijing, but in southern China, especially in Shanghai, many dialects are spoken, many dialectal variations. There are Catholic Chinese people, yes, I mean there are also various religious groups. Dialectal variations, all with the same writing system. Traditional Chinese, which has tens of thousands of characters, and simplified Chinese from Mao, which has a few thousand. Now, I'm not a sinologist, correct me if I say something stupid, but the important thing is to emphasize this. So a certain homogeneity of the Chinese people. Then you have, especially in the tribal areas in the south, in Yunnan, in Tibet, and in Xinjiang, distinct cultural identities. But be careful, a Han Chinese, even if he is Muslim, will build his mosque with pagodas. I've seen this with my own eyes. There is a strong tendency in Chinese civilization, a great strength of Chinese civilization, to absorb everything that has come in. The Mongols became Sinicized, the Turks became Sinicized, the Muslims became Sinicized. The Jesuits, the famous Euclidean Jesuits, dressed like Buddhist monks to enter the emperor's court, as Battiato sings. They understood that if they wanted to bring Christianity to China, they had to dress as Buddhist priests. They used Confucian cultural references to translate Christian texts and depicted the Virgin Mary as the goddess Guanyin, who is the goddess of compassion in Buddhism, for example. China is a land of mixtures, of syncretism. The underlying culture is Confucian, which is a philosophy of life. But there are all the various deities of Chinese paganism and the deities of the Taoist religion, which is yet another religion.
It's also interesting that Buddhism and Shintoism have had a very strong influence in Japan.
Shintoism is native to Japan. Shintoism,
which has many things in common if you look at it with the ancient, let's say.
they take some things from Chinese Buddhism. For example, Dragon Ball, the story of the god Shimya, and the novel Journey to the West, which is typically Chinese. Japanese and Korean culture take a lot from China. Western cultures take a lot from Greek and Latin culture. There is a cultural foundation there. Shintoism is Japanese, Japanese, Japanese.
It's the deep roots. They are roots, for example, even of Christianity. Now, the famous number 12, which goes back to the time of Gilgamesh. To give you an idea, there's the Sumerian stuff, the famous fish-shaped pointed hat of the Pope, which actually clearly goes back to that. Here,
exactly. No, that's precisely how it is. That's precisely how it is. So these things are there. Manichaeism, which is a religion of Iranian origin, completely disappeared in Iran, but it passed to China, where it became a mystery religion. It spread within the secret sects that later gave rise to the triad, that is, the Chinese mafia. Next slide.
There are tensions between the state and the various religious denominations because of past frictions, the communist period, and so on.
In China, the state has always controlled religion. The emperor must officiate the rites. Confucius already said this. So traditional Chinese religion, Confucian rites to heaven, and Taoism are under imperial control. In the imperial palaces, there is the Taoist pagoda, the Confucian temple, the Buddhist temple, religions under state control. Obviously, this causes friction with the great universal monotheisms, Islam and Christianity, with all that follows from it. Today, the Chinese state, under the Red Dynasty, is called the Communist Party, but it's just one of the other imperial dynasties. The Red Dynasty tries to do what Chinese emperors have always done, which is to control religions. No? This causes problems, especially with the Catholic Church regarding the appointment of bishops, with a dialogue that continues led by the king. This is progress after decades of persecution against Christians and important openings made by Pope Francis.
But the Chinese approach is interesting, rather than taking the violent approach the Japanese did. For example, remember the Christian uprising and then the extermination of Christians in Japan. They were actually banned, exterminated, and banished. Entire castles were burned down where Christians had hidden and were besieged. The Chinese prefer a method of control. It's pointless to oppose a religion. It's better to control it directly.
Trying to control, yes, the Chinese have this approach, which doesn't rule out even severe persecutions, especially during Maoism. But yes, the Chinese approach is a bit less clear-cut than the Japanese one. China seems unstoppable, but it has great internal weaknesses. I have a dear friend with whom I traveled to China last summer who saw all the hyper-modern Chinese cities. Little robots deliver food to your home, taxis, and the first self-driving cars are all electric and ultra-modern. He would go around and repeat, "That's it, they've won, let's surrender." He was shocked by the modernity of China. The Chinese haven't won, because they have a demographic situation, as you can see here, that's devastated. Compared to them, Italy is doing well. China has a devastating demographic collapse. That's why they invest so much in automation and robots. And then obviously with the inefficiencies caused by an economy that is still planned, still largely centralized, which causes distortions in resource allocation, which happens less in a pure market economy. So, in order to look good and achieve GDP growth targets, regional governments in the Soviet Union, they produced huge steel slabs that were useless, while in China, they built cities. You travel in China, you see the famous ghost cities that are completely empty.
It doesn't make much sense. If the population is declining, building all these cities does raise the GDP, sure, but then they end up as white elephants, which, by the way, Italy is also famous for white elephants.
No, but here it's on a different scale. I mean, they've built cities for millions of people that are empty and will remain empty. So you understand that you're wasting resources, capital, energy, and so on.
I wanted to ask this because I don't think it's ever really addressed. How is migration to China viewed? I mean, we've literally seen labor shortages in Europe lead to a major influx of people driven by wars and famines, but also deliberately encouraged. I mean, I remember 500,000 Syrians, 2 million Turks in Germany, and so on. There was also a search, so to speak, for low-cost labor. Does China have policies encouraging people to come to China or things like that, or is it not particularly open? Japanese culture is tough. Lately, they have made. The other day, I was watching Ciao Giappone, a channel I did a live stream with 4 years ago. Shout out to them, by the way. Who says that now in Japan, for example, they've made it much more restrictive to get a visa. Stuff like if you want to get a visa renewal, you have to have been in Japan for at least 5 years previously. You have to work, you have to pay huge taxes. We're talking about thousands of euros for a visa. So the Japanese, who have always had this as a general culture, now have it even more. They've become even more closed off than usual.
So Confucian-based cultures are basically resistant, but not out of malice. It's just that they're cultures that are hard to adapt to. China has had a culture that was very open to foreign influences throughout its history. They have absorbed all the religions that came from outside. Buddhism, in fact, which is making a big comeback because like all old societies, China too is turning towards fatalism. The Buddhist temples are packed like this. Paradoxically, they're full of young people. By the way, I asked my Chinese guide, but you say that the country is officially a communist country, and so it's not separated. Officially, you promote secularism, but why? Here, the Buddhist temple in Shanghai is full of young people praying, and she looks at you, takes 30 seconds, thinks it over. What answer can I give? There is religious freedom in China? No, the state promotes secularism. Yes, I understand. That's the refrain. But why are there so many people at the Buddhist temple here, all young people? In China, there is religious freedom. Don't repeat the story they've told you to repeat. I used to go pretty hard and so on. Yes, actually, many young people are Buddhists. They've returned to Buddhism. The fourth time I would ask them the question. So these are all the signals that a society gives you. In fact, they later explained to me that in order to pass exams in a school system that grinds you down, like the Korean and Japanese ones, young people pray. Why do you pray? You're desperate, you can't pass extremely difficult exams. If you don't get into university, you're done for, or you have to pay bribes. Because it's a country, it's a devastating corruption problem. We'll talk about it. So China is very open to other cultures, very curious, excuse me, but communism, like Buddhism, isn't a Chinese product, right? But they cynicize them. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, development with Chinese characteristics, Buddhism and Indian religion with Chinese characteristics. So Japan, no, Japan takes a lot of technology. It's very curious about the world, but it doesn't want foreigners. The problem, in my opinion, is that on one hand, there's a lot of racism among ordinary people, but on the other hand, it's hard to adapt to Chinese culture, even just learning the language. There's an African who comes to Europe and he already knows 4 words of French. The relationship with Europeans has already been mediated by colonialism, by the media, by religion, maybe Christianity, right? Congolese and Catholic, and he speaks French. It's easier to adapt to living in Belgium, in the former colonizing country, right? In China, you really struggle to adapt to a culture that is completely...
There are advantages and disadvantages. Not having a relationship like we do, a controversial one with Africa. Surely you start from a less problematic blank slate in terms of relationships. Then maybe there are language barriers, limitations of this kind, and distance too. Almost all African countries speak French.
So it's also about geographical distance. And then, guys, let's not kid ourselves about people's racism. which maybe isn't the same kind of bad racism as us Europeans or Americans who put on white hoods and if you're black, set you on fire. Or us Europeans who create strange parties that go after immigrants, right? In China, maybe that's not there, also because the government wouldn't tolerate it. It happens in the border regions where there are Cambodians, Thais, especially Cambodian girls who are kidnapped, sent to work as prostitutes by the triads. So this does happen. And maybe in those areas there are lynchings of foreigners, but then nobody talks about it. Because it's not something the government likes. They don't want to give that image of China, but it does happen. But I'm telling you, you go to China, you're European, people are shocked, they're curious, less so in Shanghai. But if you go to Chongqing in the interior, they want to take a picture with you with the long nose. They call us long noses because to them we have long noses. They touch your beard. I had a big beard. At that time, they would touch your beard. It's not racism. It's just the strangeness of seeing a foreigner. You are an object of curiosity. That is, as long as you are a man.
I follow Il Mercato's English language channel about an American. He speaks perfect Chinese. He enjoys going to Chinese places in China and starts ordering everything in Chinese. And they are amazed that he speaks excellent Chinese. They see him as an alien.
When I was walking around with my friend, people would stop us. They wanted to touch my beard. They wanted to take a picture and so on. And it was a bit like being a sideshow attraction. But there was no hostility. When a black person passed through Shanghai because the American national team of I don't know which sport was there for some championship, it's something strange, like an alien. So there was at least a bit of, if not outright, hostility. Is the foreigner a strange creature? Well, that's what you felt. Obviously no one knows a word of English, not out in the interior, but in Shanghai, a city basically founded by the English. In a 5-star hotel, everyone with their phone and Google Translate. So there was definitely a nationalist turn and fallback. I'll give you an explanation later because we'll get to that. Can I get the next slide? China's weaknesses. Gentlemen, with what's happening right now, don't you see anything strange on this map while I'm plugging the power cord into the computer? Look here. The United States has realized that if they want to hit China, they have to use oil as leverage. The Middle Eastern wars, from the invasion of Iraq in 2003 to now with Iran and Hormuz and Venezuela. That is, if you want to hurt China, you have to strike there. The United States still controls the seas and the straits. China doesn't have bases around the world to project its power. Now, you're the expert on military matters, but this map is very illustrative. 54?
I think as long as you have the advantage, you use it.
Yeah, that's right. 54% of the crude oil that China imports comes from the Middle East. Draw your own conclusions. Draw your own conclusions. Then there's Russia on top, I get it. But in short, depending on the Russians for oil and gas, the Chinese prefer to diversify. They have a strange view of the Russians. They have a kind of folkloric image of them. My guide in Beijing, our guide in Beijing said, yes, it's a strange neighbor. We see them as the drunkards who ride the bear. For us, they are folklore. There was the Russian goods store in downtown Beijing with the Katyusha music playing in the background. They sold vodka, they sold chocolate, folklore, folklore. But at the government level, when I asked my guide, but will you invade Taiwan? I really asked those questions. He didn't remember.
One day I'll get a phone call from a Chinese prison.
Unprompted, he replied, we're not the Russians. The tone was, we're not stupid like the Russians who go invading other countries. I hope he was right. Taiwan will return to the motherland, but peacefully. I'll just leave you with that. Now, next slide.
Does it answer this? It depends on where. In Prato? No. In Livorno? Neither. All bars and all Chinese takeout places? No. In my opinion, it's a matter of habit. In Prato, nobody notices a Chinese person, but guys,
But it's normal that the person.
if you go to the Svalbard Islands, you're probably the only Chinese person on the Svalbard Islands. Someone would look around, right? So it's all relative. But that's because there isn't much access in this sense. There's no way to attract this. Look at America. America has everything because, at least before Trump, it was a very cosmopolitan country in this sense. So it has always based its fortunes on immigration.
But yes, but then I repeat, I just finished saying that in China, I haven't seen or heard about the kind of bad racism that we Europeans have towards non-European populations. I mean, I just finished saying that in America, black people who were more or less kidnapped and brought as slaves to America were set on fire by the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, I don't understand why this person wants to make everything a problem. In Milan, if you're Asian or black, nobody stares at you in such a cosmopolitan city. If you go to certain areas of my home province in Bergamo, well, people stare at you in a bad way. Exactly, not if you're black or Asian, but if you're from another part of Italy. So let's look at the context. Here you go. Can I get the next slide? Western strategic culture and Chinese strategic culture. Here I put chess, and here instead I put the game of Go. Go is the Japanese name. The Chinese name, if I remember correctly, is Weiki, which I'm definitely pronouncing very badly. Saying go in Japanese is easier. Many things from China reach us through Japanese culture. Bonsai is of Chinese origin. The dress and the kimono are of Chinese origin. Many things. Some even say that sushi might have Chinese origins. I won't go that far. However, since China was closed off for decades because of communism, while Japan was opening up to the West and Western consumerism, many Chinese cultural products reached us through Japan. Now, Western strategic culture, chess and the game of Go. Chess. Opponents face each other symmetrically, one visible codified move at a time to basically conquer the center of the chessboard. It's a battle. Western strategic culture, from Thucydides through Machiavelli, Roman and medieval war manuals, Montecuccoli up to Clausewitz. Western strategic culture is strategic culture of battle, of the kinetic moment, of the plan. You kill each other, right? Chinese strategic culture is Sun Tzu. The greatest and most general is the one who disrupts the enemy's plans and wins the war without even fighting a single battle. Do you understand? It's a paradigm shift. It's a fundamental difference.
There's also a technical difference in terms of the number of combinations. It's a crazy thing. 3 to the 361st power.
And here we come
to another point, the language itself. People often wonder why the Chinese are so good at math. Well, just imagine having to know at least 2,000 or 3,000 characters to read a normal newspaper. I mean, you're making a huge mental effort from a very young age anyway. We get by with, 21 letters of our own, just to give you an idea, and their game is much more complicated, n times more complicated than chess.
Yes, because the game of Go isn't about conquering the center of a board and fighting there. The winner is whoever captures the others or checkmates the king. The game of Go is won by preventing your opponent from capturing extra points, from moving. It's a strangulation, and it's slower, it's longer. So the Chinese strategy is also an indirect strategy, influenced through overseas Chinese communities, the use of intelligence, the use of triads, of Chinese mafias. Deng Xiaoping opened up to them in a big way, the patriotic triads, right?
It's not that I'm responding to Danto because he says talk about his girls. Guys, you need to learn how statistics work. Examples like a friend of mine or my cousin don't count. We're talking about how many excellent minds in mathematics come out. not just because of demographics, but because society pushes people in that direction, a bit like in the Soviet Union, where there was a very high number of engineers. Why? Because Soviet societies tried to promote mainly technical studies. For example, in Romania, philosophy was abolished, just to give you an idea. It's obvious that this way, many more engineers came out, and by producing many more engineers, the percentage of top-level engineers increased. As if we were all forced to become engineers, right? In this sense. Obviously, the chances of having someone at a higher level increase, but the same goes for Japan. Even in Japan, they also have a certain inclination towards studying due to an extremely strict system. It forces everyone, and inevitably the number of outstanding individuals who emerge is higher. It's the system itself that is extremely geared toward producing talented people because they are encouraged from the very beginning. If someone is talented, they advance in that system. Here, they might just study at dams. Maybe a great mathematician is needed, but instead he ends up at dams.
Can you zoom in a bit on the slide so we can see the books? Here, Clausewitz on War, Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Obviously, I've simplified things, guys. Don't get upset. We have to. There you go. Now, next slide, we're getting into the reasoning. Here I ask myself, the comparisons made based on the data, by rule of thumb, how many submarines does China have? How many submarines does America have? How many ships in total does China have? How many does America have? How many frigates? Because you see that the Chinese have a huge number of ships, and then there's the entire Coast Guard and the fishing boats that can be requisitioned or used for war purposes. The Chinese have zillions and trillions of ships, so as Enrico was saying, let's surrender, they've won. It's not enough. The Chinese, the last naval battle they fought was at the end of the 1800s against the Japanese, and they lost. After that, they haven't carried out any more complex naval operations. The border clash with Vietnam in the 1990s, on the other hand, they managed to win, as we were saying. The Americans emerged as a naval power. They are a naval power and have been for more than a century now. The Americans carried out their first amphibious operation with the Marines in the 1800s against the Barbary pirates of North Africa. The Americans have really been doing this for centuries.
They learned the lesson. What was the biggest danger regarding the American War of Independence? It was the English naval blockade. They immediately understood that you need to have your own navy. In fact, the first ships they brought out, like the Constitution, just to give you an idea, or the Trincomalee and so on, were already planned. Since we are not able to produce as much as the English, so our frigates. Since they have live oak, they have a particularly hard wood, they need to be able to face more ships at the same time. They immediately understood what the decisive factor of English power was. You see, even in this chart, which is a bit old, at the bottom it says the tonnage, 1.8 million. Now maybe it's 2.2, 2.3, even 2.5 million. Because actually they have many ships, but if we compare the firepower of an American destroyer with that of a Chinese destroyer, you realize that Chinese destroyers have only a third of the firepower of an American ship. Even an old one that might be 20 or 30 years old, just to give you an idea. So you shouldn't just look at the number per class, but also at what kind of armaments you have on board. For example, I've never looked at the Russian Navy saying that a Russian destroyer is worth the same as an American destroyer or a Russian cruiser as an American cruiser. Why? Because the Russians pack their ships to the brim. The Moskva, or the Kirov if you prefer, had almost twice the firepower of its American counterpart, because the Russian strategy was basically, they'll sink our fleet anyway, so in a battle we fire everything we have and try to cause as much damage as possible. So just looking at a ship of one class versus a ship of another class doesn't tell you the whole capability. And I'm simplifying here, leaving out technologies, communications capabilities, how well they can communicate and coordinate, and so on and so forth. The bulk of what the Chinese have, even though they're improving in terms of domestic production. And go check out the live stream we did with Lanzara and Bassi. About the Chinese parade, pay attention. In the last Chinese parade, there were 0 Soviet origin vehicles. It was all local stuff, all homemade. While in the Navy, they still have a lot of derivative designs. For example, one of the 3 carriers is still an old carrier that was made in Ukraine.
And yet, what do the Chinese still buy from the Russians? Aircraft engines very often. Because in that field, not always, but in that field, the Russians are still better than the Chinese. And I think that's the last advantage the Russians still have. An advantage that will eventually run out. I'm asking you for the next slide. Reforms, investments, modernization, and then we'll also talk about corruption. As you can see, China and the Chinese armed forces have changed. Since the proclamation of the People's Republic in 1949, the People's Liberation Army, which is not an organ of the People's Republic of China, but is an organ of the Chinese Communist Party, which controls it through the Central Military Commission. That is, the People's Republic of China does not have an army. The Chinese Communist Party has an army. So, strong political control over the armed forces, as in all communist countries. So it was focused on ground troops. The General Staff of the People's Liberation Army directly controlled the army. It was the General Staff of the army. Then it had the Navy and the Air Force, which had their own General Staff. The army had primacy. They were very backward. There was no concept of joint operations. The Navy and Air Force were just branches of the ground troops. The Chinese doctrine evolved over the decades when, in the 1990s, they began to introduce a concept of joint operations. Realizing what the Americans accomplished with the Gulf War in Iraq, looking at the outcome of the Gulf War in the early 1990s, so that's where the Chinese doctrine evolves, by studying the Americans. They are very good at studying what others do.
There has been a major evolution. This was the old structure, just to give you an idea. If someone wants something extremely detailed, which reflected a lot, this is the structure to give you an idea back in Stalin's time. I put all the equivalents for you. This was in the live streams about the purges, to see how basically much of the structure of the Soviet Stavka was adopted by the Chinese army, at least up until the last 5 years. They are changing a lot. For example, in your slide, you could see the new commands, right? The command structure, organized by regions and so on, is somewhat reminiscent of the American-style command structures. So they are changing from an operational point of view. There, the political part still remains, because the political administration, this was from the Red Army era, still exists, namely the Political and Legal Affairs Commission, the Central Committee. And they still have the Politburo part. As you can see, it has remained completely Politburo, Standing Committee, among other things, which control all branches of the army. Moreover, they also decide who passes and who doesn't. The assessments, because they are not only evaluated on the operational, tactical, and strategic level, but also from a political point of view. So it's interesting to see that they are evolving. My theory during the live about the purges was that this modernization of the armed forces is in clear contrast with the political dictates. If you want to have an efficient army like the Chinese one is becoming and carry out joint operations, you need to have a degree of operational, strategic, and tactical independence, much higher than what, in my opinion, the party is willing to allow. There have been various episodes in history where, in the end, I'm not saying rebellions, but there have even been attempted coups. Still, every time the army tried to raise its head, the party put it back in its place. And at this particular moment, the Chinese army practically no longer has a general who has had war experience.
We'll get there, we'll get there, we'll get there. So, the Chinese doctrine, as we've seen, is evolving towards an increasingly joint force approach with more and more technology. Now, if I remember correctly, the Central Military Commission coordinates a general staff for different armed forces, which, however, are centered on 5 theater commands: joint, with what used to be the 2nd Artillery Corps, which has become an autonomous functional command. The Strategic Missile Force, which is the one that has intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. That logic is now essentially a Western-style joint force approach. Next slide, however, there is a serious problem. On one hand, corruption within the armed forces, as in all Chinese government structures. It's a country that has a truly insane corruption problem, and the Chinese citizen knows this and accepts it. Why does the government tolerate corruption? Because it's a tool they use later to clean things up. If everyone is corrupt, everyone has something to hide, everyone can be purged. This is the pattern of purges that Xi Jinping has just carried out. Eliminating, among others, the most independent-minded generals, including the last one who had combat experience, the officer who fought in the Sino-Vietnamese War.
If I'm not mistaken, Zhang Yuxia was the last one, right?
Zhang Yuxia, exactly. So, removed. Under investigation, there is one actively serving. To the extent that we get news from China, guys, because it's not like there's all this transparency.
Yes, I saw some news that I had found for that live about the purges. Actually, I found out that one of them wasn't taken out by Xi Jinping, but was taken out by the other clique. So they were also eliminating each other to try to gain power. Then Xi Jinping came along, and since Zhang Yuxia's clique was winning, Xi Jinping removed Zhang Yuxia's clique. So it's not even clear if they will appoint others or if it will be reformed. Right now, he's basically acting in that role, but he's the only one left.
How did Guzanti put it? I keep 4 or 5 of them all pissed off at each other so they can't stand each other. Exactly, that's the point. So now, when we analyze the Chinese armed forces and China's ability to wage war, we're talking about a country with enormous industrial capabilities, which we in the West will never match again. Enormous technological capabilities, which we in the West today struggle to match, a devastated demography. Who are they going to send to die in war? Their only children. They're automating, right? And an army plagued by nepotism and corruption, where people are promoted for political loyalty rather than competence.
And no experience.
So that's the point. What am I saying? That there's no corruption in the United States? I'm not saying that. That there's no nepotism in the United States? I'm not saying that. That there are no promotions for political loyalty in the United States? Just look at who the current Secretary of War is. So let's say that the current US leadership claims to want to counter China, but they're basically working for nothing. This is something that's completely obvious. Clearly, in China, all of this happens on a different scale, a Chinese scale. Then it's true that you have an industrial production capacity, I repeat, that the West will never match again. We won't catch up with them anymore. We have to cut it off at the head. There you go. But it must also be said that China doesn't have the combat experience that the United States has. And let's hope they never get it. That's the real point. On the other hand, when it comes to technology, the competition is open. I'll respectfully defer to you and Marco Bussi here, but I want to give you a few points to think about. We said that China is a communist country. Yes. According to the constitution, yes. They still have 5-year plans. The thing that defines communism is state, public, collective ownership of the means of production. Nowadays, you can even own land and buildings, I believe, as well as factories. So the privatization of the means of production is almost completely accomplished. So the transition towards a capitalist country de jure, as well as de facto, is extremely advanced. However, there is a party called the Communist Party, which, according to the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, has primacy in the governing bodies. There are other minor parties. There are 8 legal parties in China. 7 of them are puppets, completely useless. It's the Communist Party that has primacy. It's a Communist Party according to its statute, and I believe also according to the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. It refers to the thought of Marx, to Marxism-Leninism, to Mao Zedong, to Deng Xiaoping, and then to Xi Jinping, who is the core of the party. You travel around China and you can't find a book by Mao? I go to the bookstore in Shanghai with books in foreign languages. There's a book of poems by Mao, but there's a section here for Xi Jinping. I go to Shanghai, to the building where the Chinese Communist Party was founded, and they sell books by Xi Jinping. Maybe there was a book by Mao there.
But the little corner, but does every leader try to, is there this cult of personality that gets passed from one to another?
The real ideology, gentlemen, is not communism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is the term they use and which I think is much more interesting. The real ideology is nationalism with Chinese characteristics, with strong control by a single party that is just the new imperial dynasty. And indeed, with a nationalism that is dressed up as an awareness of the antiquity and superiority of Chinese culture. I'll give you some insights about certain ideologues. Wang Huning, who is the main intellectual reference point for Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. Wei Wei and Yang Suetong, who are 3 major ideologues of the new Chinese nationalism. Some, like Yang Suetong, are more nostalgic for Mao, while others, like Wang Huning, have a more modern approach, but they are all nationalist theorists. What remains of Mao? Well, the portrait in Red Square, you won't find a book. However, Chinese Maoism itself, unlike Soviet communism, never really tried to spread much or fund Maoist parties. They had a relationship with the Khmer Rouge, they had a relationship with some guerrilla factions, Africans, but mostly they were parties abroad that referred to Mao declared themselves Maoists, like the Indian Naxalites, like the Maoists of Nepal, like Shining Path in Peru. If I'm not mistaken, China wasn't trying to support them. It did what it did, unlike the USSR, which financed and supported, sometimes even militarily, a whole array of communist parties around the world. What remains of Mao in China? Not much, just some personality cult and devotion. At the party level, though, in practice, actually very little. There's more Xi Jinping in today's China than Mao. Here, this is the point. It's more Confucian than communist.
So incogni is the solution to your problems and mine. So gentlemen, thank you, honestly. I get a lot more hassles. I know that many of my followers use it since incogni has renewed for the coming months as well. Here comes President Mortadella again. Good job, Davide. You got the reference right away. The reference. Here we are.
Here we go. Sorry for the interruption. Next slide. Let's move on to the reading recommendations. This is to say that everything I've told you tonight is not the rambling of a madman. Not because I'm not mad, but because they're not ramblings. There's a wide bibliography. So Nicola Cristodoro has been a guest on this channel. He's an intelligence expert, and he wrote this great book on Chinese indirect strategy. How is the dragon's move applied? I absolutely suggest you read it. So this isn't an indisputable text. There you go. Very, very effective. What about military matters then? Is Simone Dossi perhaps the leading expert on Chinese strategy in Italy? Recently published by Il Mulino, The Steel Wall, which analyzes Chinese doctrines. So, Simone Dossi, every 2 or 3 years, wants a book of analysis on Chinese doctrines. He reads the documents, keeps up with Chinese websites, so read his books.
It must be said that the Chinese do not publish their doctrines.
In fact, in the book, he explains with them.
Then speculating and trying to piece it together is what they do, just like the Americans. Look, we're doing multi-warfare. They bring out papers or things like that as if there isn't a white paper.
The Russians do it too, because the Russians also write a doctrinal document, at least a framework one, especially about the MAI,
The Russians write it.
Well, those are more generic, but for example, if we look at what was written in the 1990s, the Americans really took a lot of that stuff to heart. There's a huge discussion about multi-warfare doctrine, etc. The Chinese don't have that. There's no book that says this is what we would like to do.
You have to get the white paper that they publish every so often. On doctrines, the reference text on Chinese military doctrines is the one by Defense for those who read English. China's military strategy, 1949. So this is a bit old.
Because active defense back then
was the very first doctrine.
It was passive defense, meaning you invade us, we attack you like wasps. You come and invade and we attack you like wasps from all sides. Then they realized, and this is where the West comes in, especially after the first Gulf War, that waiting for your opponent to strike you. If it's the Americans, they'll knock you out, so you can't do that. So you go back, you change the concept, that is active defense, keeping the opponent at a distance, which is basically what all the powers do. The Russians are obsessed with buffer states. The Americans want to fight wars anywhere except in America, preferably on the coasts of Europe or Australia or in Taiwan. They keep the opponent at a distance. That's their concept of active defense. What really strikes me, especially looking at what's been happening in China over the last 20 years, is that they've learned pretty much all the lessons from Japan. If you look at the period when Japan industrialized and started challenging Russia, and then the Westerners in general, they even forget their own traditions. I mean, they adopt Western-style clothing. Watch The Last Samurai, even if it's kind of a bad movie and a bit silly, even if it's only loosely based on reality. But it has some aspects that are actually realistic, like the fact that you could no longer wear the samurai hairstyle and so on. Then, gradually they relaxed because they realized that you don't necessarily have to wear a jacket and tie to do things. Good. You can also remember your own culture. It's no coincidence that during World War II, they produced more than 3 million katanas, because that culture remained even though they had banned carrying swords in the 1920s and 1930s, just to give you an idea. So things had changed. Because if you look at Japan's militaristic progression and its economic one, even from an industrial point of view, it closely resembles the Chinese trajectory. And in fact, what was it? The Japanese idea? It was to create the sphere of co-prosperity and to expand Japan's sphere of influence all around it, in order to fight a potential adversary as far away from the homeland as possible. In the end, you always come to the same conclusion if you have to build a military force, a navy, and so on. This is where the concept of active defense comes from. When I saw the lines, not just the famous one with 13 dashes, 1110, then it depends on the document. But also the second line that the Japanese would like to reach, it really reminds me more or less of the lines they wanted to achieve. A little AAA. So this active defense means a defense much farther from the homeland. We're not talking about the coast between China and Taiwan. We're talking about going far beyond Taiwan. Even starting to get closer to Guam, which is a concept because after all, those are international waters. Who can stop me from keeping my forces there?
Exactly. On this, I refer to a book written by a couple of my friends, The Pacific Challenge, which is a book. It's a book. Yeah, well, it works. Come on, let's throw this into maybe some infographics, a little book, one of those small, short ones. It doesn't take up much space.
The only book discussing this topic.
So it's kind of, let's say in Italian, it's the reference text. Now, jokes aside, for those who, like Lanzara, are passionate and feel sexual excitement, on the technical details of airplanes, there are all the Aryan books. This one is about the J-20, the stealth fighter. And then there are those from Arpia Publishing, but I see they're publishing less and less. They've made some beautiful things, though. On top, Flashpoint China, with the analysis of all the military districts, the aircraft, even estimating their numbers, and so on, the imported versions of Sukhoi produced in China under license, copied. A wonderful publishing house. It publishes very little. I don't even know if it still exists or if it shut down a few years ago. I would say that the point of reference today is Alien Publishing in terms of quality and production continuity. We'll get to military issues later. Here's the Chinese history for those who read French. We have Etienne Balaz's The Celestial Bureaucracy, a study on the economy and society of traditional China. A great sinologist, perhaps the greatest sinologist of the great French sinological school, which produced Marcel Granet and some extraordinary works. Etienne Balaz, from the economic and sociological perspective, is perhaps the most important, published by Il Mulino. Return to Confucius, which explains how there is a re-evaluation of Confucius, who was almost banned during the Cultural Revolution. So, with Mao, at a certain point, what happens? The friction starts, he takes more power into his own hands, expels the Soviet advisors, the famous Sino-Soviet split, so there was a quarrel with Khrushchev. We need to industrialize, the great leap forward.
An obvious reason, he's destroying the myth of Stalin, so Mao is building his own cult of personality.
Exactly, the great leap forward. Everyone living in the communes, everyone farming, everyone producing steel with widespread and inefficient steelworks. Let's exterminate the sparrows so they don't eat the types of grain. The result, I don't know. We can't even count the millions of dead.
It's estimated at 40 to 60 million. Yes.
There's something crazy. So what does Mao do?
It's strange because they're exactly the same mistakes as the Soviet Union. Industrialization, collectivization of land, and so on. Then they made others pay for it even more, like Ukraine, but also other places, even internally. So it's also interesting to see that they're repeating exactly the same mistakes with exactly the same results.
With Khrushchev's advisors telling him, don't do that, we've already been through this, but he kicks them out. So what does he do? Mao engages in self-criticism and launches the Cultural Revolution. Basically, he takes the new young members of the party and purges the older ones who criticized him and consolidates his power with the Red Guards. China falls into chaos, practically like a civil war, which will only end with Mao's death. So China falls years behind the rest of the world, and Deng Xiaoping will have to open up the country, modernize it, and so on. Confucius, who had been set aside during the Cultural Revolution, will later be rehabilitated. And this book explains the whole story. Then, regarding the framework and ancient Chinese history, I always find Jean Sellier's books, Atlas of the Peoples of Asia, unbeatable. It's a summary, it gives a beautiful synthesis, it's rigorous, it's precise. The book is unbeatable. 2 reflections on contemporary China, 2 enlightening books from the perspective of China on the United States. So, the American Mirror on the love-hate relationship between China and the United States. It's an extraordinary book. It's so well written that you just devour it. My compliments to the author, whom I didn't know before. It's an amazing book. Read it. How did China open up in the 1980s? How did it embrace American culture? And then what happened? And then this push for openness is almost betrayed because the Chinese feel betrayed by the Americans. But we wanted to open up to you, and now you're pushing us away. But also the return of Chinese nationalism. This book written by a Chinese historian, so a Chinese perspective on China, rise and fall of imperial China, social origin of state development. The thesis of this book is enlightening. The history of China is basically rich monks, poor monastery, poor monks, rich monastery. When you have a strong emperor, a strong central power, it crushes the emerging bourgeoisie, crushes the aristocracy, crushes local autonomy. The Chinese state is strong, but civil society becomes impoverished and sows the seeds of later disintegration. It's a criticism of Xi Jinping and praise for Deng Xiaoping. Give up a bit of central power. Let the bourgeoisie flourish, an aristocracy, a merchant class, let trade and civil society grow, right? And yet in China, there's the myth of strong government, because Xi Jinping's idea is we achieved great things when we had Qin Shi Huang. He drove out the Mongols and the Huns. Sorry, had the Great Wall built, the Ming emperors who drove out the Mongols, Mao who drove out the Japanese. So, the expulsion of foreign invaders is done by a strong king, a strong emperor. That's what China needs.
It's not like we're missing the myth of the strong man in Europe.
That's it. Congratulations and thank you. China will dominate the 21st century, but will be limited by internal weaknesses. If I knew, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. I don't know. It's too difficult a question. I have no idea. Maybe the two things aren't even mutually exclusive. Maybe China will be the most important country of the 21st century, but it won't be an absolute and overwhelming dominance like America's, because its internal weaknesses will prevent it. Who knows? Maybe the two things aren't even mutually exclusive.
Well, I want to take a guess. If China doesn't make the mistake of going to war, it will probably be the leading civilization on the planet. If it doesn't make that mistake there. Because after all, it has everything it needs to have power without necessarily having to use it. From a kinetic point of view, they have the largest economy, the greatest industrialization, they use soft power well, and they don't have a problematic history with most of the world. Maybe don't ask Indians and Tibetans that, but generally for the rest of the world, it's not a problem. So all they would need to do is not start a war, not make the mistake that all countries make when they industrialize, militarize, and so on, to start a war, because that would be the biggest disaster for a country like this. Unfortunately, 4,000 years of military history tell us that it always ends up there. I hope for Chinese wisdom, because honestly, in this mess we've been dealing with for the last 4 or 5 years, the only ones who have been more rational and sensible have been the Chinese.
See, so far, they haven't had the foolishness to wage wars and plant flags all over the world. There's a commentator who writes, in all their millennia-long history, they have never tried to go beyond their own geographical area. They've never carried out colonial expeditions. What is their geographical area? Who decides it? The geographical area? No. China has also had its own share of expansionism, as we've seen before, from the two rivers growing over time and so on.
Also because it's a damn huge continent.
Who decides what the geographical area is? The Almighty assigns everyone a geographical area. It doesn't work like that. Go ask the Turks of Turkestan and the Chinese, but let's be careful. I'm not trying to be xenophobic. Yellow peril. On the contrary, I hope for Chinese wisdom like Mirko does, and I hope that a millennia-old civilization deserves deep respect. Faccia valere in modo positivo. On the other hand, though, I also don't want to idealize everything that's not Western, nor say that Western white people are colonialists, evil, the ruin of the world, and everyone else is good. I mean, I don't want to do either. It's
kind of the theory, right? It's easy for nuns to be chaste in the monastery, but let's bring them to the nightclubs and then we'll see. It's the same thing here. Let's see when they have a huge army, a huge navy, if it's easy to stay chaste or if they'll use it. Because the tendency is to use it regardless of your history.
I mean, you shouldn't do that. I don't want to be either xenophobic or xenophilic or driven by anti-China hostility. I want to give the most objective interpretation possible. Here I give you the sources, then we will share the slides. And now I ask Mirko, I hope Giovanni Cecchini is following us. I told him to follow us because there's my cinematic segment, Lanzara, there's the airplane fetish, I'm a film buff. To Professor Maria Di Cardelli, how should we view China in the world? What does China export as a cultural product? The cuisine? And cinema?
I love Chinese food. At least once a week I go to a Chinese restaurant. It's my favorite cuisine. I find it really varied and also healthy. Burning the bread, I mean oil.
Basically, great cultures produce great cuisines. There's no doubt about it. So then a varied cuisine with regional varieties, with fine cuisine, court cuisine, and an extraordinary popular cuisine. Cinema. The other great product is cinema. So, Chinese cinema, we can look at that cinema to understand that history, that civilization. Here, I want to steal another 10 minutes from you. Freedom of expression during the worst periods of Maoism was in Hong Kong, where both an action cinema was born. Here I give you Hard Boiled, which is a classic, but also a more intimate, more introspective cinema. If you haven't seen In the Mood for Love, guys, it's one of my 10 favorite movies. It's a film of sweetness, of grace, of introspection. The cinematography, the music, the performances, it's a heart-wrenching film full of highs and lyricism. You really have to see it. In the Mood for Love, you have to see it. A cinema of introspection where you see a globalized Taiwan, businessmen traveling the world. Next up is Hard-Boiled Ramallah. I said Taiwan, I meant Hong Kong. Sorry, Hong Kong, Hong Kong.
Hong Kong on Hard-Boiled.
And it's action cinema, it's entertaining cinema, it's a kind of cinema that very quickly meets the tastes of Western and American audiences. So there's also an eye toward exporting cultural products. The language then slowly begins to evolve, even in mainland China. With the opening up of the 80s and 90s, new forms of expression emerge on the mainland. And we have a cinema that starts winning awards at Cannes, the Palme d'Or. Farewell, My Concubine by Chen Kaige, who now makes propaganda films, but at the time made films with more freedom. The 90s were a period of freedom in China, of greater freedom. And then 4 Oscars for wuxia, which is the genre of fantasy or martial arts costume films, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
Fantasy films, but with historical references, because it's interesting. Some of the masters mentioned there, like the Green Sword and so on, actually draw from myths. Ang Lee, a great director, made 4 films. I also love the whole series, like The Battle of the Three Kingdoms.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Unlike Indian cinema, which I can't stand, Bollywood, Chinese cinema,
The Indian?
it hit the jackpot when it came out with certain martial arts movies.
Mind you, there is Indian art cinema and there's serious cinema in Bangladesh too. Pather Panchali is one of the films considered most important in world cinema.
Here is a jet.
I'll get there. The problem is that Indian cinema pulls you out. Salam Bombay, made by the mother of Mamdani, the mayor of New York. By the way, though, it produces an endless amount instead of this popular cinema, which doesn't speak to non-Indian cultures. These dances, these references to Hindu mythology, it's really hard. Chinese cinema has found its own language. The openness of the 1990s, the right to criticize. Social criticism, Beijing Bicycle and Bicycle Thieves. A masterpiece of Italian neorealism that criticizes the conditions of Italian society after World War II. Here, China's boom era society is being criticized. These directors have the courage to even criticize China's success. Today, that's unthinkable. Beijing Bicycle is another film that I find moving, as well as The Woman from the River about Suzhou River. It's extremely hard to find. I had to catch it in a restored version at a cinema in Milan. It was incredibly difficult to find it anywhere else. But this film, again, has such lyricism and an ability to tell a story through cinema without any excess from the director. Chinese cinema is all about essential, very clean shots. It's a highly visual cinema, one that gives a lot of space to the actors' interpretations. You can distinguish the styles of certain directors, like those who make blockbusters, such as Zhang Yimou, and we'll get to that now. Because then there's the propaganda film hero, the blockbuster. Zhang Yimou, on the other hand, is an exuberant director, a director who leaves his mark on what he does and makes great use of color. Big, sweeping shots. The government lends him soldiers to use as extras, just like Stalin did with Eisenstein. He's called the Chinese Eisenstein, and he was the director of the shows at the 2006 Beijing Olympics. So this is an incredible film, really entertaining, grandiose, powerful, huge, colossal.
Huge battles, of course. The martial arts are always over the top. The House of Flying Daggers.
Exactly, Zhang Yimou's era, exactly. But Hero is a propaganda film. The state is celebrated, a great state, a great kingdom of great laws then. Quindi, propaganda of great value.
With reference also to China's humiliation.
Exactly, flashy propaganda. Here's the Battle of Lake Changjin. For me, you can't watch a film about the Korean War for historical accuracy. It's like Mickey Mouse in the Crimean War and the Korean War.
They're about the Japanese, where you see the Chinese killing the Japanese like Rambo, but not Rambo, more like a Hot Shots version of Rambo.
Yeah, really stuff like that.
Like a Chinese guy killing 700 Japanese when we all know very well how it really went.
If I may say, propaganda, well, today there's real propaganda. Damn, the worst offender is the Chinese Rambo. That's Wolf Warrior. From the point of view of, however...
Wait, I'll give one person a pass. In that movie, there's Scott Adkins.
Yes, yes.
Scott Adkins, guys, watch his movies if you're martial arts fans, because he's not very well known, but he's a beast when it comes to martial arts. Scott Adkins.
Technically, there's nothing to criticize about Wolf Warrior. Technically, there's nothing to criticize about the battle at Lake Changjin. You can see they have resources, you can see they have money, funds, you can see they know how to use them, you can see they know how to do special effects. Too much computer graphics in Battle of Changjin. Wolf Warrior, on the other hand, is flawless, and so is another movie about a fighter pilot. I can't remember the name right now, a Chinese version of Top Gun. It was great. 800 Heroes, a colossal film about the resistance in Shanghai against the Japanese. I mean, technically, there's nothing to criticize about these movies. The problem is that apart from 800 Heroes, which is actually good on its own,
it's not bad. I watched it, but you know, in this, they're similar to the Japanese. Watch The Last Voyage of the Yamato, a very rhetorical Japanese movie.
Very
rhetorical, very romantic. That voyage ended badly for nothing. Lately, the Japanese have been disappointing me. They're starting to make films that are vaguely nostalgic, that celebrate things I actually love. The Yamato is a terrible story. They called it Hotel Yamato because it practically did nothing. And lately I've noticed that the Japanese have remade the Yamato movies twice, because one came out a couple of years ago.
The Men of the Yamato, the Men of the Yamato, the Men of the Yamato, where the sacrifice of no is celebrated. So too much rhetoric. You also see the decline in taste. I mean, you can't tell if the Chinese audience is asking for nationalistic products. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think it's the government that's pushing them on the audience. And the artistic level declines.
Yes, because it has to be said, Jet Li, hero. But if you go see The Forest of Daggers, even just from an aesthetic point of view, it's beautiful. And anyway, it also had some deep concepts inside. I saw it. I was a kid when I watched these things. They're quite a few years old now, and I remember the quality of the tea doesn't matter when you're in a good mood.
Yes.
Yes.
So I believe that Chinese cinema, with its great culture, produces great cuisine and great films. The evolution of Chinese cinema tells us a lot about the country's history, including its cultural history over the past decades. Critical cinema, introspective cinema, quality cinema, cinema for export, propaganda cinema, more for the domestic audience. Let's compare it with Indian cinema, with high culture works of great realism. For India, I mean the whole subcontinent. Pathar Panchali, a Bengali film, Salam Bombay, but many other works of Indian cinema, a cultured cinema. And then you have this mass of films in local languages, in Tamil, etc. It's the largest film industry in the world, but it basically produces things that are unpresentable outside the subcontinent, at most in some African markets. You get romance stories and soap operas. It's really, really hard going. Chinese cinema has a good average level, and it has a decent export market.
But
what can you do? It's heavily impacted by politics and by this nationalist turn in recent years.
Which wasn't the case in the 2000s or even in the 1990s, by the way. A final honorable mention for those who want a good laugh, Shaolin Soccer.
Well, it's trashy.
A trashy movie. But they also later moved into comedy films, which already existed anyway. Because if you look at it, Jackie Chan made pretty funny movies, so funny that he was later moved to Hollywood. But Jackie Chan's first movies were all made in China.
The whole wave of Bruce Lee and martial arts films was born there. Hong Kong, the gateway from China to the West and from the West to China, has been Hong Kong. For decades, it has had...
Look what they reminded me of, Drunken Master.
I'm not familiar with it.
Watch it, watch it. It's in the drunken style. It's an amazing thing, Drunken Master. Watch it because it's really great. I'll take note. The Great Wall with Damon, I think it's an abomination.
But it was an attempt to bring Zhang Yimou, if I remember correctly, to Hollywood to make a film. So, do you remember The Millionaire, that Indian movie that won the Oscar? A tearjerker melodrama, a tear-jerking story, a story that makes you cry. The idea was, let's combine Hollywood with Bollywood, right? We take a happy ending story, a tear-jerking story that Americans like. We add Indian dance numbers. We add Indian actors who speak English. We create a bridge, even a commercial one between the two worlds, and we make it win the Oscar. Remember that who wins the Oscar is decided by the major studios for commercial purposes. There you go, a film controversy, but I mean, it still smolders. It launched Patel as an actor who now plays leading roles, is a producer, and made a film, Monkey Man, even martial arts. Action in India. But looking at the Western market, so Patel as an actor tries to act as a bridge between the Indian industry and the Western industry with mixed results. He's not bad. I don't particularly like him. I find him decent, expressive. He always has that sad puppy face no matter what he acts in. You can tell I'm not a fan. Chinese cinema, in my opinion, has reached heights of absolute lyricism, both in well-made propaganda like Hero and in Suzhou River or in The Mood for Love, which I consider masterpieces of world cinema. Not just of Chinese cinema, because in my opinion, cinema is truly a universal language, and when it produces masterpieces, it produces masterpieces. Because Fellini's 8.5 is a masterpiece no matter which culture it belongs to, and Kubrick's The Shining is an absolute masterpiece, a lesson in cinema for any culture it belongs to. Chinese cinema has reached those heights several times.
Gentlemen, I would say we've said it all, at least for this brief introduction to Chinese current affairs. And as we can see, China has lately been watching and spying on the B2 spirit. They are trying to use OSINT data aggregation techniques to follow certain events, but they are not particularly vocal about world affairs. We will see each other during the week, probably for an update. Ukraine, unless Trump wakes up in a bad mood tomorrow morning, and who knows what we'll do. Another live stream about artificial intelligence, this time applied specifically to data aggregation for OSINT research and so on. We're working on a live stream about Mexico, Combati himself, and so on, because there are a lot of connections between China, fentanyl, and America over there. So I really thank the president, who even on Sunday makes himself available for these things. Thank you all. Have a good Sunday and good night. Bye, guys. Good night, everyone.